It is hard to imagine what it would feel like to be so close to the last chance of life, and then losing it all in a matter of a few seconds. Well, that is what happened to the Lynyrd Skynyrd, an American rock band formed in Jacksonville, Florida, just 2 days after the release of their album Street Survivors. It was just when their career was going well, the tragedy struck. What do you think happened to Lynyrd Skynyrd? And do you think anything could have prevented this tragedy? Lynyrd Skynyrd was an American rock band formed in Jacksonville, Florida. The group originally formed as My Backyard in 1964 and comprised Ronnie Van Zant, who was the lead vocalist, Gary Rossington, the guitarist, Alan Collins, the guitarist, Larry Junstrom, the bass guitarist, and Bob Burns, the drums. The band spent 5 years touring small venues under various names and with several lineup changes before deciding on Lynyrd Skynyrd in 1969. The band released its first album in 1973. By then, they had settled on a lineup that included bassist Leon Wilkeson, keyboardist Billy Powell, and guitarist Ed King. Burns left and was replaced by Artemis Pyle in 1974. King left in 1975 and was replaced by Steve Gaines in 1976. At the height of their fame in the 1970s, the band popularized the Southern rock genre with songs such as Sweet Home Alabama and Free Bird. After releasing 5 studio albums and 1 live album, however, the band's career was abruptly halted on October 20th, 1977. Little were they aware of the tragic future that awaited them in the future. And what's the most disturbing thing is that nobody could have expected this at all. In 1972, when the band then composed of Van Zant, Collins, Rossington, Burns, Wilkeson, and Powell, they were discovered by musician, songwriter, and producer Al Kooper of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, who had attended one of their shows at Finocchio's in Atlanta. Kooper signed them to his Sounds of the South label, which was to be distributed and supported by MCA Records, and produced their first album. Wilkeson, citing nervousness about the sudden fame, temporarily left the band during the early recording sessions, playing on only 2 tracks. He rejoined the band shortly after the album's release at Van Zant's invitation and is pictured on the album cover. To replace him, Strawberry Alarm Clock guitarist Ed King joined the band and played bass on the album, or the only part that Wilkeson had not already written, being the solo section in Simple Man, and also contributed to the songwriting and did some guitar work on the album. After Wilkeson rejoined, King stayed in the band and switched solely to guitar, allowing the band to replicate its 3-guitar studio mix in live performances. The band released their debut album on August 13, 1973. It sold over 1 million copies and was awarded a gold disc by the RIAA. The album featured the hit song Free Bird, which received national airplay, eventually reaching number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, which was quite an impressive record for the band, as it was just the start of their career and it has started to jumpstart. Lynyrd Skynyrd's fan base continued to grow rapidly throughout 1973, largely due to their opening slot on the Who's Quadrophenia tour in the United States. Their 1974 follow-up album, Second Helping, featuring King, Collins, and Rossington all collaborating with Van Zant on the songwriting, cemented the band's breakthrough. Its single, Sweet Home Alabama, a response to Neil Young's Southern Man, which reached number 8 on the charts that August. Young and Van Zant were not rivals, but fans of each other's music and good friends. Young wrote the song Powderfinger for the band, but they never really recorded it. During the peak years of the band, most of their records sold over 1 million copies, but Sweet Home Alabama was the only single to crack the top 10. By 1975, personal issues began to take their toll on the band. In January, drummer Burns left the band after suffering a mental breakdown during a European tour and was replaced by Kentucky native and former U.S. Marine Artemis Pyle. The band's third album, Nothin' Fancy, was recorded in about 17 days. Unhappy with the band's lack of preparation for the album's recording, Kooper and the band parted ways by mutual agreement after the tracking was completed, with Kooper mixing the album while the band left for the tour that had precipitated the constricted recording schedule. Though the album fared well, it ultimately had lower sales than its predecessors. Naturally, because it wasn't that well planned when compared to the previous albums. Midway through the Nothin' Fancy tour, Guitarist Ed King abruptly left the band after a falling out with Van Zandt. King's guitar roadie and Van Zandt were arrested together and spent the night in jail. With his guitar roadie unavailable, King played that night's show with old strings that broke and caused his performance to be substandard, and Van Zandt subsequently belittled him in front of his bandmates. King quit and returned home to Los Angeles, believing Van Zandt had been responsible for his guitar roadie being in jail in the first place. Collins and Rossington both had serious car accidents over Labor Day weekend in 1976, which slowed the recording of the follow-up album and forced the band to cancel some concert dates. Rossington's accident inspired the ominous Van Zandt-Collins composition, That Smell, a cautionary tale about drug abuse that was clearly aimed towards him and at least one other band member. Rossington has admitted repeatedly that he was the Prince Charming of the song who crashed his car into an oak tree while drunk and stoned on Quaaludes. With the birth of his daughter Melody in 1976, Van Zandt was making a serious attempt to clean up his act and curtail the cycle of boozed-up brawling that was part of Skynyrd's reputation. On October 20th, 1977, the Jacksonville, Florida-based band left Greenville, South Carolina, after a concert at the Greenville Memorial Auditorium, having little idea that a tragedy was about to unfold, and boarded a chartered plane en route to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were scheduled to perform the next night at Louisiana State University. They didn't make it. Near the end of the flight, the twin-engine Convair CV-240 ran out of fuel. After the pilot and co-pilot determined that the plane didn't have enough fuel to land at a nearby airport, they unsuccessfully attempted an emergency landing and crashed a few minutes before 7 p.m. in a wooded area. Cassie Gaines had been so fearful of flying in the Convair that she had preferred to travel in the band's cramped equipment truck instead. But Van Zandt convinced her to board the plane on October 20th. Another member of the band's trio of backup singers, who were collectively known as the Hunkettes, JoJo Billingsley, was not on the plane as she was under a doctor's care in Senatobia, Mississippi, dealing with health problems brought about by substance abuse. Billingsley planned on rejoining the tour in Little Rock, Arkansas on October 23rd. She reported dreaming of the plane crash and begging guitarist and founding member Alan Collins by telephone not to continue using the Convair. The band's ex-guitarist Ed King said later that he always knew it wasn't going to end well for the band due to their penchant for drinking and brawling, but he could never have envisioned it ending the way it did, and recalls being overcome with sadness upon learning of the crash. For the details of the accident aren't all out, but according to what we know, the rescuers had to cross a 20-foot wide or 6 meters waist-deep creek and dig through an overgrown forest while digging out rescue vehicles that got stuck in the mud. Locals worked with rescue officials and drove victims to the hospital in the back of pickup trucks. One local resident recalled, "I found someone on the ground alive. When I walked to the other side of the plane, I tripped on another person." Another resident commended the actions of all those who helped and highlighted that some of them were out on that highway directing traffic. Some of them went home and got tractors. My wife was home on a CB radio. I'm relaying messages on CB to her 10 miles away. After the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB, removed, inspected, and tested the right engine's ignition magneto and found it to be operating normally, concluding, "No mechanical or electrical discrepancies were found during the examination of the right magneto." The inspection also determined that all of the fuel crossfeed and fuel dump valves were in the closed position. Billy Powell, among others, spoke of seeing flames shooting out of the plane's right engine during a flight just days before the crash. The subsequent report by the NTSB listed an engine malfunction of undetermined nature in that same engine as a contributing factor in the crash. Pyle told Howard Stern years later in an interview that the fuel gauge in the older model plane was known to malfunction, and the pilots had neglected to check the tanks manually before taking off. Toxicology reports from both pilots' autopsies found no traces of alcohol or other drugs. Crew inattention to fuel supply was ultimately determined to be responsible for the crash. The accident report records that the aircraft was both owned and operated by L&J Company. but the lease to Lynyrd Skynyrd's production company specified that Lynyrd Skynyrd was the operator, and therefore was responsible for regulatory compliance, including managing the flight crew. The flight crew were employed by a third party, and the lease period was 3 weeks. The report records the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, as taking legal action against L&J Company in relation to the operator responsibility, and the analysis section concludes by asking, how does the system in such a case protect a lessee who is uninformed either by design, by inadvertence, or by his own carelessness? The crash took place 2-3 days following the release of the band's 5th studio album, Street Survivors album. The album cover showed the band surrounded by flames. Following the plane crash, MCA replaced the image with a new cover, showing the band against a simple black background which was on the back of the original sleeve. The site of the crash has become a memorial for fans, rescuers, and survivors, with an oak tree that has been carved with Lynyrd Skynyrd iconography, while the site was also the location of a 40th anniversary memorial by survivors and rescuers. On January 28, 2009, keyboardist Billy Powell died of a suspected heart attack at age 56 at his home near Jacksonville, Florida. No autopsy was carried out. He was replaced by Peter Keys. On March 17, 2009, it was announced that Skynyrd had signed a worldwide deal with Roadrunner Records, in association with their label, Loud and Proud Records, and released their new album God and Guns on September 29 of that year. They toured Europe and the US in 2009 with Keys on keyboards and Robert Kearns of the Bottle Rockets on bass. Bassist Ian Evans died of cancer at age 48 on May 6, 2009. Scottish rock band Gun performed as special guests for the UK leg of Skynyrd's tour in 2010. On May 2, 2012, the band announced the impending release of a new studio album, which was named Last of a Dying Breed, along with a North American and European tour. On August 21, 2012, Last of a Dying Breed was released. In celebration of the release of this album, the band did 4 autograph signing events throughout the Southeast. Lynyrd Skynyrd used a Confederate flag from the 1970s until the 2010s, and naturally, because of this, several criticisms have been raised against them ever since, because of this very same reason. While promoting the album on CNN on September 9, 2012, members of the band talked about its discontinued use of Confederate imagery. In September of 2012, the band briefly did not display the Confederate flag, which had for years been a part of their stage show, because they did not want to be associated with racists that adopted the flag. However, after protests from fans, they reversed this decision, citing it as part of their Southern American heritage and states' rights symbolism. The band would later cease use of the Confederate flag, starting with their 2019 tour. In 2017, surviving members of the band and family of those who died in the crash filed a lawsuit to block production and distribution of a film entitled Street Survivors, the true story of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. The dispute stemmed from a blood oath by survivors, reportedly taken after the crash, never to use the name Lynyrd Skynyrd again in an effort to capitalize on the tragedy that had befallen them. The film premiered at the Hollywood Real Independent Film Festival on February 18, 2020. Lynyrd Skynyrd disbanded after the tragedy, reuniting only on one occasion to perform an instrumental version of Free Bird at Charlie Daniels' Volunteer Jam V in January 1979. Collins, Rossington, Powell, and Pyle were joined by Daniels and members of his band. Leon Wilkeson, who was still undergoing physical therapy for his badly broken left arm, was in attendance, along with Judy Van Zandt, Teresa Gaines, JoJo Billingsley, and Leslie Hawkins. Rossington, Collins, Wilkeson, and Powell formed the Rossington-Collins Band, which released 2 MCA albums, Anytime, Anyplace, Anywhere in 1980 and This Is the Way in 1981. Deliberately avoiding comparisons with Ronnie Van Zant, as well as suggestions that this band was Lynyrd Skynyrd reborn, Rossington and Collins chose a woman, Dale Krantz, as the lead vocalist. However, as an acknowledgement of their past, the band's concert encore would always be an instrumental version of Free Bird. Rossington and Collins eventually had a falling out over the affections of Dale Krantz, whom Rossington married and with whom he formed the Rossington Band, which released 2 albums, Return to the Scene of the Crime in 1986 and Love Your Man in 1988, and also opened for the Lynyrd Skynyrd tribute tour in 1987 to 1988. The other former members of Lynyrd Skynyrd continued to make music during the hiatus era. Billy Powell played keyboards in a Christian rock band named Vision, touring with established Christian rocker Mylon Lefevre. During Vision concerts, Powell's trademark keyboard talent was often spotlighted, and he spoke about his conversion to Christianity after the near-fatal plane crash. Pyle formed the Artemis Pyle Band in 1982, which occasionally featured former Honkettes JoJo Billingsley and Leslie Hawkins, and released 1 MCA album titled APB. In 1980, Alan Collins' wife Kathy died of a massive hemorrhage while miscarrying their 3rd child. He formed the Alan Collins Band in 1983 from the remnants of the Rossington Collins Band and released 1 MCA studio album, Here, There, and Back. He was visibly suffering from Kathy's death. He excessively drank and consumed drugs. On January 29, 1986, Collins, then 33, crashed his Ford Thunderbird into a ditch near his home in Jacksonville, killing his girlfriend Deborah Jean Watts and leaving himself permanently paralyzed from the chest down. Rossington was the last original member of the band, but he died on March 5th of 2023, and at this point all the original members of the band are now deceased. In April 2023, the band had confirmed that they would continue their tour without Rossington, despite his death. There were agreements and discussions about how many pre-crash members had to be in the band in order to continue this activity as legal. But this doesn't seem to be applicable any longer since the death of the last original member, Rossington. Throughout the band's career, even with ups and downs, they had gathered a large group of fans. This tragedy, which is not remembered as the Lynyrd Skynyrd tragedy, took a huge toll on the band's career, and the untimely demise of some members naturally shook a lot of people and saddened the fans of the band. Even with everything that the band faced during their career, they have made a remarkable impact on the music industry that will be remembered forever. And the band's music will be loved forever by the fans.